Oh dear, so many people have asked for classic or older vehicles, and you can't get any more old and classic than the '89 Nissan Skyline GTR. This is a real treat to get inside because it is so rare. Let's take a look at the interior, the exterior, in the shop, and a quick driving evaluation. The interior space of the Skyline is as 80s and 90s as you can possibly imagine. It is so simple. It's about really one thing, driving. And I love this compared to so many of the brand new cars I get into where I have to spend 3 days trying to figure out the infotainment, the bugs in it, how it works, the electronic gauge cluster to get it to show what I want and what I don't want, the 10 different drive modes that affect the steering, the throttle response, the suspension damping. That's not what this is about. It's about pushing in the clutch, starting the car, which you don't even have to push in the clutch to start the car. There's no safety switch like we need for us dumb Americans. It's just shifting, driving, and steering and enjoying this experience. Now, the interior space of this GTR is about as stock as you can get, with the exception of this Pioneer head unit and this Momo steering wheel, but the horn still works. Other than that, really, you have 3 gauges on the center stack, which, you know, you're never going to look at: your voltage gauge, your oil temperature gauge, your boost gauge. And then in the center gauge cluster, it's your classic tachometer, speedometer, and you do have one gimmick, a torque gauge, which, you know, is absolutely silly. But everything else in here, aside from it being right-hand drive, is completely intuitive. And I think, you know, if you're just getting in here for the first time, you're going to be like, wow, you know, what are people so excited about with this? As you would expect for a 30-year-old vehicle, there is some wear and tear, and I'll be straight, this thing is in amazing shape. But you can tell the things that haven't held up well over time in the interior, like the traditional dash bubble on the passenger side where the adhesives have come undone. The driver's seat looks like a used pair of underwear. The door cards aren't perfectly in place. There's UV rot on the plastics. The vents are broken in the center and feel so brittle I don't even want to touch them. But for the most part, you can tell, honestly, this thing is held up very, very well for its low 60,000 miles or 104,000 kilometers. All right. Let's head into the shop and talk about the Nissan GTR and all the technical aspects of it, and then we'll take it for a drive. Welcome to the shop segment at Phase Garage in Ames, Iowa.
You made it all the way out here.
Yes, I used the teleportation device that Jeff Goldblum used, or Seth Brundle in The Fly, and luckily I don't have any superpowers yet. We'll see.
You brought the flies with you, though, on this 95-degree day with 95% humidity.
Yeah, this is the worst day to film. I swallowed about 600 bugs, but let's not talk about that. Let's talk about the R32 Skyline GTR that is on the Benpack lift, Jack.
Yeah, this is a 1989 R32 GTR that came directly from Japan. Phase Garage imported it to Ames, Iowa.
And there is an owner of this, correct?
Yeah, who's currently trying to sell this particular car.
Okay, so if you're interested and you want to buy this, contact Phase Garage. The mechanic here will give this away for a lofty sum, I'm sure. But let's get into the mechanical stuff, because that's what people want to know. You don't typically see something like this every day, and given its age and its propensity to rust, go figure, this is an unbelievably clean example of a car that is, what, over 25 years old.
Over 25 years old. This car is
almost 30 years old.
Almost 30 years old, yeah.
It's crazy, especially for a Nissan. Now,
it's not a Datsun, remember, it's a Nissan.
Yeah, it is a Nissan. In the front, even though this is that old, we have double wishbone suspension. Now, you do have some cast steel parts, the lower control arm, but your upper is all stamped. The knuckle design to the upright, to the upper A-arm, there's only there's typically the A-arm is supported on both sides. This is only
as
on
a
one.
singular, but it is an incredibly beefy design.
It is, and the ball joint design is crazy, and you don't typically see this at all anymore. And of course, it's dated, but it works for what it is. Now, if we go back a little bit further, of course, there's no paneling. This predates any type of aerodynamic covers or airflow. This is just a mess under here, especially when you look at all the hydraulic lines that are running front to back.
In a modern car, most of this would be primarily electronically controlled. In this case, it's almost all hydraulic.
All right, Jack. In the center of the car, you're going to see this, a 5-speed manually operated transmission.
It's fancy stuff.
It is. You have to use your arm. Your left arm, because this is right-hand drive. You get used to it pretty quick. Now, the transmission is extremely direct, but the gearing on it, it's really short.
It is incredibly short.
So when you're in 5th gear, you're like at 80 miles an hour, you're already at like 4,500. There's not a lot of overhead there. And it's just part of the driving experience. So many cars, you add more and more gears.
People complain about the modern GTR not being visceral, and in this case,
yeah, this is more back to basics. All right, now that we're in the back, you're going to see a very sloppy looking rear differential that is spewing, looks like oil and Oreos all over it. But we're going to talk about HICUS first, and HICUS, all that is a fancy term for
rear wheels steering.
Yes, and you have 2 hydraulic lines that run from the front. There's a pump that's under the hood that's separate from the power steering system. There's 2 lines that run all the way back to this module, and this module is controlled by an ECU. It's integrated into.
Because this car's got 3 ECUs.
Well, it's got more than that technically, but you have
for the drivetrain.
For the drivetrain, but you have an ECU specifically for the all-wheel drive system,
which is located in the trunk,
which we're going to get to in a second. So this is all hydraulically actuated, and it will give you somewhere about 5 degrees of tow. So when you're turning, the front wheels, and the car has to be running because it's hydraulically driven, has to be running, and it will give you some assist. And it's
way different than a modern steering system.
Very much different. The modern systems, if you look at it, it's just a electronic unit, usually by Ames, and it just has a wiring harness to it, and it gives you a little bit of electrical
Even the
system.
feedback, the way this car turns in, is way different.
It's very mechanical feeling, and there's so much. It's very mechanical because when you turn, you have hydraulic power steering, and then this back end kind of responds whenever it feels like it wants to. And partly it could be age, and I think that's why so many people that get the GTR remove this, because after a while all the bushings wear. The toe links wear, and it can't return back to the correct toe, or it can't do it based on its old specifications. So a lot of people remove this in the lines because it adds weight. The second thing to talk about is the Atessa all-wheel drive. Okay, and that is another hydraulic system. There's an accumulator up here that is constantly charged,
and a reservoir as well.
And a reservoir that is constantly charged with hydraulic fluid, and all that does is it charges the clutch pack that is in the front half of the car, and that's the differential, and that will slip and unslip the front axle to lock and unlock, because this is a rear-wheel drive platform by design. So this is kind of the tacked-on all-wheel drive.
Yeah, because the rear-wheel drive model is called the GTST.
Correct. And I honestly, with the age of this, unless you were just going to keep this as a show car, I wouldn't want any of this stuff on here. It is just to make sure it's working right. All of that crap, because of its age, I don't know, it just gives me the EBGBs. Jack, we made it under the hood of this Nissan. What do we have?
Well, this particular car is from 1989, and with that comes a RB26, Nissan's legendary motor. It's an inline 6 with twin turbos, ceramic turbos, so you know what that means.
That means, as we know, given 30 years of experience, if you plan on modifying this more than what this has, you have to be careful, because the ceramic turbines get brittle and they can break. So if you're planning on modifying it, you need to replace the turbos. But other than that, when you look at this under the hood, despite how amazingly clean it is, this engine looks like it could power a freight train. It is huge, and the bottom half is cast iron, but the top half, the heads, are aluminum.
The motor's amazingly stout, and even from the factory, this thing made 276 horsepower, largely due to Japan's gentleman agreement among manufacturers to limit horsepower to such.
Yeah, it's incredible. If you take a look at the horsepower numbers for the liter, 2.6 liter pushing out over 300 horsepower at the time was just insane. And the fact, as you looked at underneath, you could see all the mechanical details that they did with the four-wheel steering, the all-wheel drive, and then you have individual throttle bodies on a turbo motor, which, they're kind of paired in twos here, but it also has a mechanical linkage for your throttle pedal. No electronic throttle actuators to go bad like some cars.
I know that's very disappointing too.
It is. I want to replace each one for $1,000 every time, but you don't have to deal with it here. You just have to keep the maintenance up, and this is I keep saying it, it's a very interesting car.
Yeah, it's both incredibly complex for the era, but by modern standards, it's pretty simple. Everything's hydraulic. Yeah. And with that, this car is a testament to Nissan's engineering in the late 80s. This whole thing is basically a giant engineering exercise.
Yeah, it is. It's pretty cool. Let's take this thing for a drive and see how it does on the street. Ah, yes, behind the wheel of the R32 Nissan Skyline GTR, and this is kind of a dream car for a lot of people. They either grew up fantasizing about it, mostly because they couldn't have it, and now you can, and a lot of people do. Now, importing a car, may not be for everyone, and when you look at the underside of this, when you look at the exterior and you know that it's going to be hard to come by parts, and all the things that you have to deal with having an older car, might deter some people. But I think the reality is you're going to buy this, you know what you're getting into, and you want to know what it would be like driving this, namely compared to some of the modern cars. So let's get into that. First, let's talk acceleration. I'm going to come to a stop here. This is all-wheel drive, and given the age, there's absolutely no way that I'm going to nail it, but let's do a rolling street start. So there's two things, and I'm going to talk about this. So the first thing is this. Compared to modern sports cars, this is not going to blow you away. There's a level of smoothness and refinement to it because it is an inline-six twin turbo, and it does make its boost higher up in the RPM range. So there is turbo lag at the bottom, but there's no tuning weirdness. There's instantaneous throttle response, and that's not something you typically get with modern turbo cars. So that's a treat. So I'd say we've become spoiled, but there is more to it than just the engine. Of course, there's the gearbox, and this is a 5-speed manual. And, it's not one that you want to tear up or, bang gears really hard, because it's not as durable as some of the modern transmissions. If you're smooth and you're precise with it, you're not going to get any grinds, you're not going to get any hesitation, and it has a amazing mechanical feel. You feel directly connected to the gearbox at all times. Heel to toe is easy, despite it being a right side drive. There's nothing weird about it once you get used to the fact the wheel's over here and you have to shift with your left hand. You adjust so quickly that it becomes super intuitive, and that speaks to how well this car, how well of a good of a driver's car it is, that you can get in here and feel comfortable right away. The other thing about it is its ride control and body control is unbelievably good for how old it is. You get in cars like this and you really miss the older hydraulic steering in some of the older 90s cars. Well, this is an 80s car technically, but it's so good compared to so many modern vehicles, it's almost criminal. Now handling, it depends on who you are, how you want to drive. The steering is not as quick as the modern cars, because a lot of modern cars are synthetically have their steering set up to have variable gear ratio, so it can be faster. The electronic power steering can give you that immediate sense of gratification, but you don't feel anything. And that's where this differs. The steering is pretty quick overall, but it's not lightning fast. You do feel that slower, heavier weight of being an older vehicle, and then you add in the rear wheel steering effect, and it has this real strange, slow mechanical delay from when the front end is turning and that rear is starting to turn a little bit. And it's something that you have to get used to, but I gotta say this, I would rather have this. I would rather have a little bit of weirdness and the sense that something's going on with the car than nothing's going on with it. And that's how so many of these modern cars are. When you turn, it feels like a video game, and this feels like you're driving the car. And I think that's the big draw of these 90s vehicles, and namely the Skyline. I think the biggest thing is people think about these as kind of like sideways machines. They're all over the place, but this is, you know, I wish more cars were like this, and I think that's why people are so in love with these older 90s vehicles, because you really do feel everything that's going on, and it's just so rare to have this type of experience anymore. And I could see why you'd want to spend $20-something thousand to import something like this. I think the biggest takeaway of the Skyline GTR is, again, we talk about this a lot on this channel, is the simplicity of the late 80s, 90s, and early 2000s vehicles that have disappeared in favor of everything else but driving. Everything's become a distraction. And when you get in a car like this, you understand right away why so many people love driving, and so many people have also lost connection with that whole experience, and this kind of brings it all back to you. Final thoughts on the Skyline GTR. Now, with a 35-year-old design, you have to adjust your expectation levels, which I have. So here's the pros and the cons. I understand why there's this cultish following with these 80s and 90s Japanese sports cars. With the Skyline, the biggest pro is this. When you get in the driver's seat, you feel this level of mechanical connection that you don't get with modern cars. You feel the vibration, you feel the connection every time you shift gears. You feel what the wheels are doing through the steering wheel. You feel vibration in your seat from the exhaust and from the engine that has been stripped out of all the modern cars. And this is something that you really can't explain to somebody until they get in this car. The biggest thing is visibility. You can see around you. You don't need, 20 different sensors to tell you if there's something around you, because all you have to do is look. There's so much glass. And this is part of that connected feel, the driving feel that you just have to experience to talk about. Now, the negatives are this. This is an import car. They weren't available in the US if you're in the US, which means you could be waiting months to get parts, if you can find parts at all. You might even have to go to different models to scavenge or find the thing you need if something breaks, which means it's for really two people: fanatics that love this car, or people that just want to buy it, stuff it in a garage as a collector's item, or drive it randomly. You just have to be careful with this. It's not like buying a 20-year-old American car that there's a million parts for. The biggest negative for me is it is dated. It doesn't handle the best. It's not the fastest. The transmission isn't the greatest. It doesn't look particularly amazing. And, for me, if you're gonna ask me would I buy something like this, I'd say hell no. I'd take a 370Z used, throw on a few modifications, and it would just annihilate the Skyline. But that's not what it's about. This is a heritage vehicle, and if you get that and you love it, well, this might be the car that you would own.